This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host, researcher and entrepreneur, Olli Tikkanen.
Welcome everyone. This is a bonus episode introducing our new podcast series and the new podcast host. So our earlier podcast series will continue with our normal hosts as before, but in addition, we will have a new series. So absolutely great news for the podcast. So in this episode, I will be chatting with our new host about her background, interest, and new series. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our new host, Anum Urooj. Welcome, Anum.
Thank you very much, Olli. Thank you for having me over, and thank you for providing me with the opportunity to be a new host of the podcast.
Yeah, I'm very excited that you can start as a new host.
Thank you. So am I.
Yeah, so we will get to the series a bit later, but should we start about you? So tell us a little bit about you. Feel free to start wherever you want.
Okay, sure. So I'm originally from Islamabad, Pakistan, and I did my bachelor's, master's, and MPhil in psychology, which is basically equivalent to 6 years of education in Pakistan. And I did it from Islamabad, and then I got a fully funded PhD scholarship at La Trobe, Melbourne. And I moved to Melbourne, and it has been amazing so far. And so I started doing research in the field of sport, exercise, and health psychology. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. And I can talk more about my PhD research if you want, because I think if you give a PhD student an opportunity to talk about their research, they never stop. They just grab the opportunity to express themselves. So, yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. You are from Islamabad and ended up to Australia. How have you, before we go to your PhD research, how have you liked Australia?
Oh, it's amazing. So I am basically in Melbourne, and I have not been able to see any other parts of Australia except just the capital, Canberra. But Melbourne, it is just so amazing. And if my memory is not mistaken, I think Melbourne has been rated the most livable city in the world on like a consecutive basis. So I remember when I moved here, it was back in 2016, people would say this thing that, oh my God, Melbourne has been rated the most livable country for the 6th consecutive time, and I'm sure the tradition continues. So it's really amazing. It's quite a multicultural place, and people are nice, and like the city is beautiful. I love the transport system, so I think everything is amazing about Melbourne.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. I have actually never been in Australia. It's just I've had plans to go, but it's so far away that I usually try to be like longer time, especially if it's a long flight. And I have always ended up like halfway to Thailand or some other place and never got there. So it's still on my list. Maybe one day I will have the long flight.
Sure, and I'm sure you'll never be disappointed. Yeah, why not? I know the travel time is a bit of a trick, because if I talk about the distance between Melbourne and Islamabad in terms of time, so it is usually a connecting flight via Abu Dhabi and Bangkok, and it takes like approximately 22 hours. So yeah, it's a long flight.
All right, so it's so long also from Islamabad, because I'm on the other side of the world, like in Europe and in Finland at the moment. So I thought that it's for us a long flight, but it's also for you. It's been a long
Yeah,
flight.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So would you like to now tell about your PhD research?
Sure. So as I said earlier, that it is in the field of sport, exercise, and health psychology, and my field of research is particularly physical activity. And what I'm looking at is basically the facilitators and barriers for participation in sports and physical activity. And the target sample is culturally and linguistically diverse women. Now, the reason why I have chosen this sample is because, as I said earlier, that Australia and then Melbourne in particular is a very multicultural country and city, respectively. So the levels of physical activity, they are the lowest among this target group. And because of the low levels of physical activity, the incidence of diseases, both physical and psychological disorders, that is the highest in this group. So the purpose basically is to do research then on this group, and whatever comes forth from the research, because we talk about facilitators and barriers, so what motivates them to participate in physical activity and what keeps them from participating in physical activity. So it can, I think, be a very good resource for not just academics, but actually practitioners and policy makers, that they can take necessary steps to make sure that, okay, these facilitators have been identified, these barriers have been identified. So what they can do now to lessen those barriers and to enhance those facilitators by providing opportunities so that the levels of physical activity among this group that increase, and then subsequently the incidence of diseases that decreases. And I'm basically, so it's actually interdisciplinary research. And so it's a combination of psychology and public health and sport management. And the model that this research is based upon is the social ecological model, which basically has 5 levels underneath. So we talk about intrapersonal or personal factors. There are social or interpersonal factors. The third is environmental. Fourth is national. And fifth is the global level factors. So the purpose of employing this model is that, as I said, it is interdisciplinary. So we are not approaching the facilitators and barriers just from a psychological perspective, but from many other perspectives, and teasing apart all those facilitators and barriers from this perspective can actually bring into light information and knowledge that, as I said earlier, can be useful for the policymakers.
Sounds like a really important topic. I think it's not only Melbourne or Australia that diverse women have a low levels of physical activity. I think it's the same in for example in UK. So really important things. So what kind of facilitators and barriers you have found?
So I have yet to start data collection, but on the basis of the literature review, I can definitely provide you with an overview. So starting with the first level, as I said, which are the individual factors. So it has both the biological and psychological factors. And we particularly emphasize upon the psychological factors. So let's say if people have lower self-efficacy, they have lower motivation to participate in physical activity, they have a lower self-esteem. So now the basic thing here is that it is difficult to say that one factor is a facilitator and one factor is a barrier, because the same factor can actually act as a facilitator and as a barrier. If you provide that factor, it acts as a facilitator. If you withdraw that factor, it acts as a barrier. So, for example, in the next level, which is the social level factors, where we particularly talk about the social support from the family members, from your friends, from the people around you, your significant others. If you get that social support, it will act as a facilitator. It will increase it is likely to increase the level of physical activity. Whereas if you do not get the required level of social support from your family and the society, overall, it will act as a barrier. So the list is long, basically. Like if I say this thing that these are the barriers, these are the facilitators, the list is long. When we look at the literature, so different researchers have identified different factors. So obviously there is a commonality that there is a set of factors which have been identified by all researchers, but then there are some factors which are identified by some researchers, and then in particular ethnic groups. Because when we say CALD, which is basically an acronym for culturally and linguistically diverse women, so we are not just talking about one group. Let's say we are talking about Muslims, and then even under the Muslim category, we have Pakistanis, and we have Somalian, we have so many other nationalities. So there are differences across ethnic groups as well, but there are similarities as well. Then if you talk about environment, so we have social environment, we have built environment, and we have natural environment. So just again to give you an example, in terms of social environment, so whether you have any role models, it could be your family, like any of your family members. It could be any of like a sport personality. If you have a role model and they exercise, they engage in physical activity. So that will act as a role model for you, and that can actually encourage you to participate in physical activity. Then you have the natural environment, like feel free to cut me off if you have a question.
No, please keep going on.
So in terms of natural environment, so for example, the parks, the lakes you have, because these are the places which encourage you to do physical activity, because physical activity is not just indoors, it is outdoors. And that is where when we talk about green and blue therapy, like green therapy close to parks and blue therapy close to like water, like beaches. And then there is built environment. This is very important because when we talk about the built environment, so it depends that whether you have walking tracks, whether you have footpaths, so whether these things are present in an epic proportion to encourage people to engage in physical activity. Now, if you look at the current research, there has been a focus on the personal or the intrapersonal and the interpersonal and the environmental factors, as I have just described. But there is less research on the next two levels of physical activity, which is where my research will contribute to the existing knowledge. Because when we talk about the national or like the policy level factors, again, just to give you an example, the transport system. So whether you have like a transport system which encourages physical activity, how? That whether you have bus stops at a walking distance from your home, that you can walk to the bus stops, and then, or maybe you can cycle to a bus stop and then you can take the bus. And then there is this urban planning. How are the buildings structured? Whether they have the green elements in them, whether they are surrounded by greenery. So these are the national factors, and then the policy level factors. So when you talk about education, so we have like all educational institutions, whether they provide you with enough opportunities to engage in physical activity. So, for example, in schools, whether the classrooms and whether when children they get breaks, so whether their breaks are divided into some like physical activities, and at the workplaces, whether you are provided some opportunities to engage in physical activity, like, the standing desks are now replacing the sitting desks. And the last level is the global factors. So the global economy, the global transport system, as we're just talking about, such long distance between Melbourne and Islamabad, or between Melbourne or any other country of the world. And then again, urban planning and climate crisis. So these are all the things which have a direct or even an indirect impact upon the levels of physical activity. So the list is long. I have just tried to provide you with an overview based upon this 5 levels of the social ecological model. And yeah, that's the thing basically that is why it is interdisciplinary in nature. That you have to take perspectives from different fields, not just within psychology, but across other disciplines as well, to be able to have a nice overarching grasp on the facilitators and barriers.
Yeah, that was a great summary of different levels of facilitators and barriers, and I think there's a lot of to study and very, very important work that you are doing. So this was what you are doing in your PhD work. What are your general research interests more widely?
Well, I think I have always been a psychology person, because the first time I got introduced to psychology was in my bachelor's. And from the very first day, I should say that I developed not just an interest or liking, but like a love for psychology. Initially, I was more interested in social psychology. I still am, but as my PhD took the direction of sports psychology. So what is interesting about this area, physical activity, I sometimes say to myself and other people that I consider it to be a blessing in disguise for me, because my research interests, whether they are pertinent to psychology or any other field of research, they revolve around physical activity in sports. So my other research interests are basically to understand physical activity in sports, because it is such a vast field and it bears relevance to almost all aspects of your life, and relevance to society and mankind in general. So first of all, I really want to understand that what is physical activity and what theoretical approaches we have to understand physical activity. And then the work of United Nations using sport as a tool for promoting development and peace, as it is one of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So that is the second thing I'm interested in. And then I have lately developed an interest in nutritional psychiatry. And again, why that is relevant to physical activity, because physical activity, just like diet, is one of the modifiable risk factors for so many diseases. So usually it's difficult to work on one thing by just getting isolated from the other things. So even when we talk about nutritional psychiatry, the focus is upon diet, but somewhere, considering the modifiable risk factors, you are talking about physical activity as well. So yeah, anything and everything which has relevance to physical activity, I am really interested in that. But let me just say this thing, that more than the sociological and the management side of it, I am more interested in the psychological and the public health aspect of it, and the perspectives that come from sport and exercise sciences.
Mm. Yeah, that's nice that you have quite wide interests, and I think podcast, it's a great way. Like when you're doing research, especially a PhD, it needs to be quite a narrow focus, and you need to spend a lot of time with like just really narrow field. But with the podcast, when you're hosting, you can have really wide interest. You get to discuss with the really clever people from different fields. So it's very nice that you have wide research interest. It's a podcast is a great avenue for that kind of balancing the more narrow research what you do.
That's
So
correct.
so
Yep.
yeah, so maybe then we can go to your new series. What will it be about, and
hmm
how it will be named, and so on.
Okay. So it was really difficult for me to come up with like a name, like a catchy name, with all the overarching themes that I want to cover in this podcast. But I have come with the title of interdisciplinary research in physical activity. But I do want to make clear that it is not just about physical activity, it is about sport as well. And I'll come to that shortly. So first of all, well, like the reason for doing this podcast is that I think, not that I'm blowing my own trumpet, but I think I have good communication skills and I like to talk to people. So I think I can polish my skills further.
But yeah, I fully agree. Yeah.
Thank you, Ollie. So since I'm a PhD student and I'm also networking with researchers from across the globe, and that is how I actually came in touch with you. So I think interviewing people from different countries and continents will actually enable me to broaden the spectrum of the knowledge that I currently have about physical activity in sport. So yeah, that will actually help me in gaining knowledge and then using this platform to impart that knowledge to a wider and general audience. I think that is very important because when we talk about um, like any area of research, the basic thing is to be able to convey it to general audience. And I think this is a very good platform to do that, especially for a topic that is of such wide significance and such broad relevance. So yeah, this is what I want to do. And then this way of networking, because introducing myself to the potential interviewees and then getting to know about their work. So I think it can help me in broadening my network as well. And in terms of what I'm going to be focusing upon, so I think this will be a repetition of what I have said earlier. I want to understand physical activity from different perspectives, from different fields. So yes, my focus is on, like, my interest is in like psychology, and I actually thought of the podcast name in the beginning to be Psychology of Physical Activity, but then I was like, no, it's too narrow a topic because then it means that I'm just talking about physical activity from a psychological perspective. And in the real essence, it's really hard to understand it if you just narrow it, because we have already talked about it, that it's quite an like interdisciplinary area. So I aim to approach this topic from a psychological perspective, and then there will be different fields within psychology to do that. Public health perspective, the sport and exercise sciences perspective, physical education perspective, which is where we talk about physical literacy and physical education teachers. And yeah, and yes, as I said earlier, so urban planning, this is very important. So it's the list is long, and to be very honest, I'm so excited about it that I have already identified like a list of people that I want to interview, and the list is long, but I just want to make sure that we'll alternate between people from different fields and offer their perspective. And the key factor here is that I want to synthesize the information or the knowledge that I'll come across from academics, from practitioners, and from the advocates and the policymakers. And I just want to somehow synthesize that information to be in a position to put forth that knowledge in front of people so that we work in collaboration. Because if academics just keep on doing research, and if you're not able to translate that research into policy and practice, then I think there's little worth of that research. It's just like confining research to papers and books, and nobody will, like, I won't say that nobody, but then, everybody will not be able to benefit from that.
Yeah, sounds absolutely great. So interdisciplinary research on PA and including sports. I think it's a very, very good addition to the podcast, and I'm really happy to have you as we have been quite European, Western centric, basically, just from the practical point of view. So you bring diversity in many forms and can have guests more easier from different places. And also it's nice to have someone from Australia time zone, so I'm not always recording 7 a.m. or in the midnight. So it's nice to have someone who can take care of those guests. And yeah,
sure. I just want to add one thing, that initially I said that it's not just physical activity, it's sport as well. So sport is physical activity. But my primary research is in physical activity, where we are not talking about, not just talking about competitive and organized and formal sport, but physical activity. My understanding is that physical activity is a more generic term that applies to laymen more. And when we talk about sport, that is more about athletes. One thing that I want to cover in my podcast is that I want to have sports psychologists comment on this thing, because when we say the term sports psychology, it immediately occurs to us that we are talking about high-performing athletes and high-performance sports. That is not the case. Basically, the principles that we learn in sports psychology, by studying the psychology of athletes, we can actually apply those principles to performance psychology, and we can apply those principles to general public. So this is another aim of my podcast, that I would like to go beyond just physical activity researchers to sports psychologists, and then see that how can their perspective of working with sportsmen benefit general people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Physical activity includes kind of everything. I think one definition of physical activity is that any muscle activity that increases energy expenditure. So basically, brushing your teeth is physical activity in a way even. But I think we don't have perfect terms here. So I think it's a little bit like sports. What is it? We usually think it as a organized top level sports. How is, for example, parkour, when you just go and do it alone, when you on your way to work and you do parkour jumps? What is it? And also in a way that when you have play, you just kind of have fun. When kids do, is it play or is it sports? I think there's a fine line between those, and then we have a word exercise, which is kind of done to improve fitness. So if you do it for some other reason, then it's not kind of exercise, even though you happen to improve. So I think we are kind of lacking maybe good terms, and some some, for example, departments, they are talking about movement culture or movement in a way that they don't need to say exercise or sport or physical activity. So I think you will have interesting discussions about these different differences from different fields of researchers.
That's correct. I agree with you. And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So is there anything else you would like to add into this discussion now?
I think I have already spoken a lot and I gave you less chances to speak. So, no, I think that's pretty much it. I'm just looking forward to interviewing like different people, and we can actually start with this thing. Like, you raised a very important concern that there is no demarcation line between the definition of different terms. They're just overlapping. So, as I had mentioned earlier, that I would like to understand it from different perspectives. So maybe having guests from different fields, they can just tease apart the differences and the similarities between these terms. So yeah, quite excited about it.
Yeah, super. So it was really interesting to hear your story and about your plans for the series. I'm really looking forward to listen to your series. So thanks a lot, Anum.
Thank you very much, Ollie.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.